we frequently have to do is, and perhaps you've had to do it as well, is import maybe a CSV file or a table of data into the database and then provide access to it through a CakePHP view, index view, or similar, and then provide the ability to download that in a CSV format. So that's what we're going to do today. Firstly, we start with our schemas here and just choose the table import wizard. Now I'm going to use a spreadsheet that I got from our Coles supermarket company, which they publish a list of addresses for distribution centres. So that's what we're going to import. Choose to create a new table, drop it if it already exists, and I'm just going to enter the data without actually thinking about too much other than just pressing next. And then when we have a look at that data, we've got a few things wrong that we can look at fixing via migrations in our application. So what we've got is the database is connected and we're ready to go. You can see that, table to connect. So to begin, we create a migration, and I'm going to call this rename table, and we go to our copy to clipboard, and let's choose that, and I want to change this to something a little bit easier to handle. So then we look at our migration statuses and we can see it's down. Now as soon as we run the status command and we refresh the database, what we'll see is a Finks log table, and the Finks log table allows us to keep track of migrations and when they're run and when they're applied. So once we have our first migration, we just say migrate, look at the status, and it's up. If we refresh our database now, we'll notice we've renamed our table. Another migration task that we might have is, let's create another migration, and we're going to say rename column. And this one is, again, really simple. And the method name is rename column. And if we have a look at our columns, we will see that the column here, postcode, for some reason has a trailing underscore, and we don't want that. So we pop in this, and we can choose update from there. And again, simply migrate, have a look at the status, and we find we've now got two migrations there. And looking at the data, is we've now got a renamed column. Easy peasy. Now another challenge that we have with this And let's look at the Cake documentation, because it really, usually if you read it carefully enough, you'll find out if there's gotchas. But notice it says here, dealing with primary key can only be done on table creation operations and due to limitations from different database servers. And so what we're going to do now, we're going to create a new migration, and this time we're going to add ID column, but it's not as easy as what we normally might do is we'd go, okay, get a reference to the table, which is DC list, and then you might use add column, and you might try and say, okay, let's add that, it's an integer, and you might say auto increment and is true, and you might say primary key, add primary key ID, and if you try that, you get, it blows up and it says something non-helpful, and it just does not work. So how do we add an ID column? Well, sometimes you might find that you need to drop back to plain old MySQL. So we might say, okay, add table, so it's DC list, add column ID, unsigned auto increment first, and here we have our adding a column. Now, one thing that you find when you do these sorts of things, you don't get, when you're using either raw MySQL commands or you have commands that it can't automatically figure out how to reverse, you'll find that you might need to do a little bit more coding to specify. So you might say if the table has an ID column, so before we attempt to run our code, we might say, okay, well, I want to remove the column ID, and because that needs to happen before this is run, we do that. And then down the other way, we would do the same sort of thing if it has this. So the down would be to remove the ID column. So now let's try that. And again, I've forgotten to just use migrate and have a look at our database and go select. And now we see that we've inserted an ID column, and we have a look at our table definitions here, and we see it's what we want, which is primary key, not null, unique, and auto increment. And it's now done it, despite having to work around that issue with it not being supported. Now let's have a look at our information. It's all in the database there. It's ready to display, and let's try that. Go bin cake bake, and we want all, and when we choose the all option, it says, well, what table do you want to bake all for? And it does our baking there. If we now type in, you can type in DC list and it will work. You can also do a DC dash list and it will work. Now, do you notice that the only column it's actually put into our index view is the postcode? Everything else seems to be displaying okay, but in our list view, we only see the postcode. So why is that? Well, going back to our database table, notice how every single one of these fields is a text field. And text fields generally, Cake sort of interprets them as being really a lot larger than a varchar, and with the high possibility of having carriage returns, line feeds, and all those sorts of things in them. So they say, well, I'm not going to try and display that in an index view, because I want, in an index view, I just want one line of text to be able to display it sort of well. So now we can go, we're going to create another migration, and this migration is change column types. And changing column types is, there's a couple of ways you could do it. You could hard code it all and just make, or you can make a list. But one thing that I found is that sometimes you can just use Cake's inbuilt. So we're looking for locator, use locator aware trait, and pop that into the right place for it to be. But you're just pulling it in basically using IntelliFence functionality, that extension. So we can go, so we can say, okay, we're going to get a reference to the DC list table here, fetch table, and we're using the alias because this is a Cake method. And what we now want to do, we want to go, okay, I want to get a hold of the schema. So this, DC list, get schema. And from the schema, I want to get a list of columns. And once we've done that, we can create a for each loop and loop through our columns. And I'm just going to use the global function PR and debug and die so that when we run it, just run it, and we can see that when we run if we have a look at our, go back to status, when we run and debug and die, it doesn't mark it as being done. So we can do some sort of run throughs and things and print things to screen so we can see what's going on in the migration. So what we want to do is we want to have a look at each column, schema, get column, and have a look at what it's popping out to the screen. So we just go migrate, and notice that each column, as we look at it, tells us what type it is. And I'm going to just make a global change. So if column, I'm going to change all of them, does not equal the ID column, and we've got to get a migration method. So we're going to say table equals this table, and then the actual table name here. Then I want to go table change column, and the column name is going to be passed in. The new column type is string, and we don't need it to be 255 characters. Let's make it all of them 100. And I think at the moment, if we look at the Right, so at the moment they're all nullable. So let's leave that as null equals true. And we can, from that, so we've changed every column except the index, so the ID column. And then when we finish doing that, let's just get the table and call update on mass. So this will now give us I think that's everything. This should now give us a migration that will, let's have a look at status again, and we can try migrating, and then having a look. I'm going to close these tabs and just have a look at the table definition here, and we can see that we've just looped through and changed them all to variable varchar 100, and they're still all nullable. Now, we remember we didn't have all these fields working, so just type in history. Let's get, and we're looking, okay, we can see it there actually. I don't need to narrow that down. So I can just go ! 88. This is on, I'm using Mac OS, but this works on Linux as well. And just type in, and that can pull in that command and run it. And then have a look at this when we reload, and we can see that we now have our information for all our supermarket distribution centers available. Now when Cake does some baking, what you can see, like the table name is DC list, but often you'll find it will make changes that you go, oh, that's not actually correct because DC should be. So you can do things like in your editor, just look for full words that are that and make changes. Just check to make sure that it's not doing anything silly, and then cross out anything that you don't want to change, and then just make the changes like that. Another thing that you can do with, let's have a look at our index view, because this is what we're looking at. So go into the DC list index view. We can also, with our columns, when they're incorrect, we can click and provide a second argument. So we can say, okay, I'm going to make that change so that it's more correct. Another thing that we often do after baking, a bit of manual labor, is to remove a heap of the columns so that it's not including the kitchen sink. So we just identify the columns that we want to keep. So I want to make this more into an address table, so get rid of some of these other details, and then just update, and it looks a lot nicer. So this is basically now at the stage where we've got the information, but how do we export this information out? Now, if you Google CSV view, I can't spell, so it's going to be a miracle if it finds it, but the very first response is this Friends of CakePHP CSV view, and this is made by one of the core developers of CakePHP, so he's on the core team. So when that happens, you know that they understand how to build something that really integrates nicely as a package. So we can, what did I just do there? Just put it into the right place. So we can install this package, and this CSV view will just go through how we can use it. And before we get fully engrossed with CsvView, what we want to do is just add we go back here, we might add a download button. Now, this might be fractionally dodgy, but what I'm going to do, go default layout, there it is, PHP, default PHP. So this is the layout file that pulls in the default CSS and all that sort of stuff, and all the views are based on it. The view information comes in, I think, in here, content. So that's where sort of a template will render its content inside here. But what I'm going to do, so that I get some Bootstrap methods that I understand, and so that I can lay things out, is I'm just going to put Bootstrap before my CSS files, because I don't understand if Milligram, which is used by Cake, has layout utilities or not. So I'm going to put that first. Milligram will override anything that is in conflict, but I'll still be able to use my Bootstrap functionality. So let's reload, and it hasn't made any functionally difference. So now what we'll do is we'll go into our index page here and div dot row. So that gives us a row with a class, div with a class of row, which is a Bootstrap utility. And then we want two columns, and just going to take the H3, which is the heading, and then we're going to copy and paste to, we might just go format on save, so that might help us a little bit when we save, and then it will do the formatting for us without so much tragedy. So here we have, we're going to create a download button that will talk back to the same controller, the DC list controller, and look for that action. If we do that now, we notice that we just need to delete some stuff that doesn't need to be there, but we want to make sure these aren't squished together like that. So the way you can do that within Bootstrap is just go deflex and then do content, actually justify content in between. So it will, and then we just need to specify that the column is 4, so it'll be 8, and that's a 4 column there, and then we've got our download. So now we just need to go and get our DC list controller and pop ourselves in, maybe at the top's good, and go public function, and we're looking for to create a download method. And I think I need to remove void, otherwise it'll complain when I start to put things in there. So we're going to look at the Friends of Cake documentation. And it starts simply how to get running with CsvView, but if we scroll down a little bit, we start to reach the territory where we've got different configuration options. And then finally we reach a patch of code that looks kind of like what we want to do, which is we want to query the table. So we've got this post table here, so let's do a search on posts, and then we want to just replace that with DC list. We might make that case sensitive so it doesn't try and replace the wrong things. Then we want to just replace posts with DC list, and that's good. and double check that that's right. Yes, it's DC list with no S. Normally with Cake conventions it would be DC lists because the table should be DC lists, but not in this case. So now it's saying, okay, do a find on that table and return, it'll be returning everything. And the documentation says, oh, make headers and just enter them like this. But we can also, again, using the schema, so we'll do that. We'll just say, we'll get a list of columns. So we say this DC list get schema and return me the columns. And from that, we can then do something kind of fancy, but not really, but we can do an array map and then do a new Inflector Cake utility, and then say that the method we want to call is humanize on this array that we're going to pass in, which is the columns. Now, you may or may not like that. You might just want to leave it the way it is. But at the present time, we're just going to comment this out. But we've got our list of headers coming from all the columns, and we've got our list of fields. And now we just want to remove that and just have a look what happens when we go back to our index view, and you hit that and we see it it hits a download, and then we open it in Excel, and as we can see, it's everything. So that's our entire table downloaded into a spreadsheet. Now there's some other nice to haves here that are in the documentation. Keep scrolling down and you'll find that you have the ability, and this is another one of the Cake methods that you can use to specify. So we could say, all right, well, we can hard code this as well, but this could be a dynamic file name. But again, if we go back, we can then see when we hit download this time, as you can see, that's now got a new name. So what else can we do with the CSView plugin? Well, as you noticed probably before, when we go back up to where we were, you can give it an array that gives it instructions as to what to extract. So in this case, we've got an ability as well to pass in a function and do something to modify the array. Now, why would we want to do that? Let's have a look at our information within here. Actually, we'll do it in the we'll do an edit. Let's go into here and grab our postcode, and let's make our postcode ridiculously long just to simulate a situation that happens more often than not if you're doing say barcodes and things like that, and you download the spreadsheet and it's all wrong. It's all being converted to scientific numbering, and that's the last thing that you want to happen. So now we can go into this using this extract array. Now what we can do, we don't necessarily want to manually do that, but what we might do is just take this, okay, and we're going to make this into, I'm going to call that, let's call it a format function, and it's just going to be a a closure. So it takes the row, and we're going to modify the postcode field. And what we're going to say is, when you see the postcode field, just wrap it in something that will make Excel understand it's going to be treated as text. So it's still CSV format, but just modify this one column to do what it needs to do. So what we can do now is we can go, we're going to say, okay, our extract array is going to be the result of mapping across our columns and taking the column, and we're going to use that format array, and then when we go and see the right column, so we're going to look at the columns, and if the column equals the postcode column, we're going to return not the column value, but we're going to return this closure. But otherwise, we're going to return the column. Now, what's that going to look like? Let's debug and diet to make sure it's correct. What that's going to look like is when we hit download, and I do this every single time. So we now need to say, convert that to an array. Go back, and now we can see that all the fields, just like the documentation says, like if you just want the field returned, leave it as a field name, but if you want something done with it, replace that with a function. So now we've done that, we can go to scroll down to where we have our extract function, and we'll go back and make it look properly so that it makes it look like we've done the right thing there. Now can you see what we've done is that embedded formatting has now allowed Excel to understand, well, okay, treat all of these columns as text, and so you no longer get this problem of badly formatted really long numbers, and which should be text anyway. Okay, so that's a good thing we can do. Now we can just delete this array because we're not using that sample code. Now another thing that is quite common, so we've got our columns defined here, and we might want to skip a number of columns, and to do that, what we can do, we can actually say, okay, still give me the columns, but what we'd like to do is pass the columns in, but then specify an array of things to skip. So new GL code, I think there was one called TPC code, and going through looking at maybe the database a bit easier. Liquor license. So you go through and just specify the columns that you don't want to include. And once you've done that, there's something you need to also do is specify, okay, if we do columns that have been reduced and then we still do a find on everything, then you've got a mismatch. So what you then need to do is say, okay, selecting these columns, and then you'll get your export will still nicely match up, and we're looking at all the columns and the headers are going to be correct. So now let's do a download again, look at our finished product, and we can see that we have just the fields that we've requested, strictly speaking. Let's finish that one as well. Go license, and they spell it differently, so _type, and let's so finally we've got exactly what we have requested. So that's using one of the many wonderful plugins made by members of the CakePHP core team. But you can see how with a little bit of reading of the documents and then playing with it yourself and reading the core documentation, things like get schema and those sorts of things, that you can really start to automate what you're doing with the information coming in and out of your tables and those sorts of things. So that, I hope, is useful to someone.